That this was a period where students who had studied in the metropolitan centers of the colonial powers began to form study groups, began to form committees, began to form unions, began to plan the struggle for independence. We can see this in the origins of the African Party for the independence of Guinea and Cape Verde that came about when Amilcar Cabral and his associates went to school in the mid-1950s. This is when the Vietnamese, who had led the resistance against the Japanese and then fought against the French, finally succeeded in defeating the French, and despite the pressure they were under from all sides, ended up creating the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which would later, in the 60s and 70s, liberate all of their country, as did the Laotians, as did the Khmer people in Cambodia. You see, an enormous percentage of the world's population finally throwing off the shackles of colonialism in the period of the 1950s, the period of the post-war period, and the preparations beginning for that to happen in other parts of the world. You can also see some of the historic failures, the failure of the tentative attempts that were taken by the Mossadegh regime in Iran, the defeat of the Palestinians by Zionist forces that would lead to the imprisonment of Palestinians in the Zionist state, which is still going on today. Some terrifying and terrible struggles that would take place in Africa, and the ascension of a whole level of neo-colonial leaderships that had supervised a very, very controlled path to independence, particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa, and who would then generate the rule of a kind of kleptocracy that would go on, and the evolution of some of the revolutionary nationalist political organizations into kind of dynasty-like oppressive regimes. One can go through all this history and say that some very, very good things happened, some very heroic things happened, and some very, very tragic things happened. And some heroic things happened, like the liberation of Indonesia from Dutch imperialism, that would lead in the 60s to the massacre of the Indonesian left and the installation of a brutal military regime. That these stories, in many, many cases, do not have happy endings, but they have optimistic, I suppose, and happy beginnings, in the sense that you begin to see the people of color, really, of the world entering the stage and beginning to take their own destiny into their own hands. And wherever you look, you see these phenomenon beginning to take place in the 1950s. So I think that if you want to look at that period, you will see an enormously diverse, varied, eclectic series of stories without being able to predict where it would go. But when we put this notion together, we thought that the one really, really happy ending in a certain kind of sense, and one relatively close to home, was the victory at the end of the 1950s of the Cuban Revolution, a victory that continues to inspire people throughout the world, and particularly in Latin America. And we were enormously delighted in terms of having that discussion about the role of the struggle for independence, of national liberation in that period, to have with us a gentleman who, as a young man, joined an organization called the July 26th Movement and participated in one of the great, as I say, happy endings of the 20th century, and particularly of the 50s, which ushered in a whole decade of other things, which was the Cuban Revolution. So in that spirit, will you please welcome Manuel Yepe.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about the 50s in Cuba. The 50s because after the victory of our revolution, and for 50 years, starting the news starting from Miami, Florida, and extended to the world by the mainstream media, controlled and paid by the United States all over the world, has made it known, or people believe, that before the revolution in Cuba, before it came to power in 1959, Cuba was Latin America's most prosperous democracy. Cuba was practically a paradise in the Caribbean, with everything wonderful, and so we revolutionaries had done something very bad to the Cubans and to the world, and that is, well, I know you know that this is not true, but I wanted to give you an idea of what was Cuba in the 50s, what had happened before in Cuba, why did Cuba start this process that has been so relevant for Latin America and to the third world in general. And that would be the object of my presentation, to tell you what the real social, political, and economic situation of our island was during the 50s. Well, it's true that Cuba was in a situation, a part of Cuba, of splendor, under the inspirational guidance of Mayor Lansky, Santos Traficante, and other leaders of the U.S. mafia that were in control in Cuba. Batista, the dictator at that time, in those days, was a friend of the mafia from the 38th, when the mafia had started the main business with him. Then, using him, he was a sergeant in the army in charge of communications, and their intelligence, the Americans and the mafia, were using Batista and gave him some relevance in politics in that period. Batista became, shortly after, in the 40s, he became a very important backstage leader of politics in Cuba, and in 1940 he was elected president, and it became public, his relations with the U.S. Embassy in Cuba, which was the governing force in our country. Perhaps we should start a bit earlier. Cuban Revolution really started in 1868, when a group of landowners headed by Céspedes, who was the first leader of the revolution, liberated their slaves, called for the suppression of slavery in the country. Many of these black slaves all of them were blacks. They joined the rebel army that fought a war against Spain. Many of them entered the first period of the war, which was called the 10-Year War, from 1868 to 1878. At the end of the war were generals and so on, and that brought up, helped very much in our racial integration of the country. You see, because the leaders of the revolution were blacks, whites. There were no difference whatsoever. Later, we had another bad influence when Americans occupied Cuba, and that was a bit forgotten, that integration that we had got. So in 1878, the war stopped. There was a truce signed by some of the leaders of the revolution, not accepted by all that protested. And the reason for not being what the revolutionaries, when they discussed why weren't we successful, because we Cubans had a complex. We were desperate. Latin America was already, Hispanic America was, most of the countries had done the revolutions and were independent about 100 years before we did. So what was happening? What happened with that war? And the war restarted in 1892, started under the guidance of Jose Marti, who is considered our national hero up to today. Jose Marti, first of all, he started uniting the people. The Spanish Empire was crumbling not only in Cuba, but all over the world. Then it was used, the opportunity was used by the United States to have the main battleship Maine exploded in the Havana harbor. They were doing a visit to the colonial government of Spanish colonial government, and an official diplomatic visit there, and the boat exploded. They said that the Spanish government had done it in order to have a pretext to intervene in Cuba. Incidentally, the picture of the boat, the demonstration of how bad the Spanish had been that had done this to the boat, was a big hole, which was published in all the American press, a big hole in the battleship Maine. Many years later, it was demonstrated that that was a picture of a black, how do you call it, when the sun disappears? An eclipse that had been used many years. That was an eclipse that every American newspaper published to demonstrate how bad the Spanish had done to the boat. But the pretext served to declare what was called the Spanish-American War and get a hold of the whole remaining colonies of Spain. And they did. They got a hold of that. And then in 1902, after an occupation with all the characteristics of occupations we now listen of in Iraq, in wherever, the occupation, they had to consent to create a constitutional assembly to draw up a constitution. Many of the revolutionaries that were accepted by the occupants made part of the assembly, and they drew a very good, quite good for the time, constitution in 1902. And when we were going to receive the country with its new constitution, then came a senator called Orville Platt in the Senate of the United States and presented an amendment to that constitution that if it was not accepted, then they would stay occupying the island longer. And the Platt Amendment established, among the many things, that the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba whenever they thought that their interests were at stake, and many other things, so that they would have special, the best commercial conditions that any other country, and that they could establish military bases in Cuba. And then that is when they established, among others, the Guantanamo naval base that has become so popular recently as a center for torture of prisoners. There was a strong man in the 30s called Machado, who was ousted by a revolution. There were conditions for a revolution in those days, but of course it was. It didn't go too far with the United States containing it. But then in the 40s, with or before the 40s, there was the need to establish better relations with the Soviet Union, and in general, they opened a bit the possibilities for Cubans to proclaim the ideas, or to study it, to speak about socialism. For the first time we were speaking about communism, and we developed that was a basis that came because of that. When we had this American interest in not being too tough on the repression of ideas in our island.